Here we are again, folks. Video games have become the scapegoat amongst certain politicians after mass shootings. Deja vu? Well, we have been here before. This is a cycle that stretches as far back as 1999's Columbine High School mass shooting incident. The latest occurrence comes in the aftermath of two horrific shootings that happened in El Paso, Texas, and Dayton, Ohio, which pretty much happened back to back. The former left at least 22 people dead and many more injured, while the latter left 9 people dead and many more injured. It really only takes the most rudimentary of common sense to conclude definitively that video games are about the furthest cause of such tragic events, but of course, these politicians, devoid of any intelligence, integrity, and humanity, will blame a medium and an art form that's brought so much joy to so many people around the world, instead of acknowledging the real issues and taking tangible measures to prevent such shootings from happening time and time again. Let's take a look at some of the things that some of these politicians have been spouting over the last few days, starting with Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick.
And I look at this evil act, and let's condemn it for what it is. Evil. Evil. And I say, how long are we going to let, for example, and ignore at the federal level particularly, where they can do something about the video game industry? You know, in this manifesto that we believe is from the shooter, this manifesto, he talks about living out his super soldier fantasy on Call of Duty. We know that the video game industry is bigger than the movie industry and the music industry combined. And there have been studies that say it impacts people and studies that says it does not. But I look at the common denominators as a 60-some-year-old father and grandfather myself. What's changed in this country? We've always had guns. We've always had evil. But what's changed where we see this rash of shooting? And I see a video game industry that teaches young people to kill. We have to look at ourselves as a nation. There's many factors that go into these shootings, many factors. And it's not a time to politicize, it's a time to look deep inside of who we are as a country. It's a lot of factors that go on that we have to take a long look at who we are as a nation and where we want to go and what we're going to tolerate.
Lieutenant
From
Governor,
social media and from video games.
We have to look at who we are as a nation, he says, while he himself is incapable of looking at himself and his complicity and negligence to prevalent violence in this country in the mirror. Seriously, how do we go from these are evil acts of mass shooting to, oh, by the way, how long are we gonna ignore that pesky video games industry? Don't get me wrong, the video game industry has its fair share of issues, particularly where rampant greed is concerned, but games have certainly never, ever in the history of this world been responsible for mass shootings. This isn't the first time that Dan Patrick has made this argument either. Recall that just a little over a year ago, on May 18th, 2018, America was shaken by the mass shooting of Santa Fe High School in Santa Fe, Texas, which killed 10 people and left 13 injured. Just like now, it didn't take long before Dan Patrick immediately dismissed all other potential causes and avenues of prevention and blamed the various art forms that keep the world entertained.
George, should we be surprised in this nation? We have devalued life, whether it's through abortion, whether it's the breakup of families, through violent movies, and particularly violent video games, which now outsell movies and music. Psychologists and psychiatrists will tell you that students are desensitized to violence, may have lost empathy for their victims by watching hours and hours of video violent games. 97%, George, of teenagers, according to psychiatrists and psychologists, watch video games, and 85% of those are violent games. Are we desensitized? Are these children? Are these teenagers? But we have to look at our culture of violence, just our violent society, our Facebook, our Twitter, the bullying of adults on adults and children on children. We have to look at ourselves, George. It's not about the guns. It's about us.
As you can see, the cookie-cutter boilerplate argument of we have to look at ourselves is something that keeps being invoked time and again. I should also point out that everything he's saying about psychologists and psychiatrists corroborating his asinine statements are completely false. I don't know where he gets his information from. I mean, anyone can say psychologists said this and psychiatrists said that and throw bullshit percentages around without citing their sources, but the fact of the matter is that the opposite is true. Research researchers have reiterated time and again that studies show the contrary, that video games have no link whatsoever to the instigation of mass shootings or acts of violence. We'll get to that in a bit. Before that, though, let's take a look at what House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy had to say.
We need to get the facts, but we need to make sure we do not allow this ever to happen again. But the idea of these video games to dehumanize individuals, to have a game of shooting individuals and others, I've always felt that is a problem for future generations and others. We've watched from studies shown before of what it does to individuals. When you look at these photos of how it took place, you can see the actions within video games and others. But
last but not least, the president himself spoke to that effect in a statement he provided during his address following both mass shootings.
Second, we must stop the glorification of violence in our society. This includes the gruesome and grisly video games that are now commonplace. It is too easy today for troubled youth to surround themselves with a culture that celebrates violence. We must stop or substantially reduce this, and it has to begin immediately.
So yeah, we're pretty much looking at the same tired, previously disproven argument. Video games glorify violence and in turn psychologically influence youth into committing these heinous acts, training them to become killing machines. That's the propaganda that's gone heavily criticized. Shortly after these politicians began to scapegoat video games, social media lit up like a Christmas tree with hashtags like "video games are not to blame," with many even telling stories about how video games positively affected their lives, myself included, as I owe so much to this incredible medium, and which is why I speak so adamantly against certain trends that may corrupt it. But beyond emotion, we need facts, and the facts do speak for themselves. Here's an interesting bit of information presented by news outlet Vox that pretty swiftly shuts down arguments that video games are to blame for any mass shootings. Featured in this article is a chart that compares revenue generated by video games in each nation per year and the number of gun deaths that occur in each nation per year. Countries listed include South Korea, China, the US, the UK, Canada, Germany, France, Spain, Italy, and Japan, all amongst the top consumers of video games in the entire world. The fact of the matter is that video games, violent ones even, exist across many countries, with South Korea and China consuming even more video games than the US. But if you look at the number of gun deaths, only the US stands out as an outlier. The United States remains the only first world country where violent gun deaths are a major issue, far exceeding all other nations that also prominently consume video games. It doesn't take a genius to see that there's absolutely no causation between games and gun violence. This isn't some new discovery either. There's plenty of research going around corroborating this. Back in 2011, the Supreme Court said that violent games have as little psychological effect on children as cartoons starring Bugs Bunny or the Roadrunner have. Here's the excerpt in question from then Justice Scalia. The state's evidence is not compelling. California relies primarily on the research of Dr. Craig Anderson and a few other research psychologists whose studies purport to show a connection between exposure to violent video games and harmful effects on children. These studies have been rejected by every court to consider them, and with good reason. They do not prove that violent video games cause minors to act aggressively, which would at least be a beginning. Instead, all of the research is based on correlation, not evidence of causation, and most of the studies suffer from significant, admitted flaws in methodology. They show at best some correlation between exposure to violent entertainment and minuscule real-world effects, such as children's feeling more aggressive or making louder noises in the few minutes after playing a violent game than after playing a non-violent game. Even taking for granted Dr. Anderson's conclusions that violent video games produce some effect on children's feelings of aggression, those effects are both small and indistinguishable from effects produced by other media. In his testimony in a similar lawsuit, Dr. Anderson admitted that the effect sizes of children's exposure to violent video games are about the same as that produced by their exposure to violence on television, and he admits that the same effects have been found when children watch cartoons starring Bugs Bunny or the Roadrunner, or when they play video games like Sonic the Hedgehog that are rated E, appropriate for all ages, or even when they view a picture of a gun. More recently, earlier this year, researchers from Oxford University published a research on this matter, and the short version says violent video game engagement is not associated with adolescents' aggressive behavior, evidence from a registered report. The long version reads, quote, "In this study, we investigated the extent to which adolescents who spend time playing violent video games exhibit higher levels of aggressive behavior when compared with those who do not. A large sample of British adolescent participants aged 14 and 15 years and an equal number of their carers were interviewed. Young people provided reports of their recent gaming experiences. Further, the violent contents of these games were coded using official European and US ratings, and carers provided evaluations of their adolescents' aggressive behaviors in the past month. Following a pre-registered analysis plan, multiple regression analyses tested the hypothesis that recent violent gameplay is linearly and positively related to carer assessments of aggressive behavior. Results did not support this prediction, nor did they support the idea that the relationship between these factors follows a nonlinear parabolic function. There was no evidence for a critical tipping point relating violent game engagement to aggressive behavior. Sensitivity and exploratory analyses indicated these null effects extended across multiple operationalizations of violent game engagement, and when the focus was on another behavioral outcome, namely pro-social behavior. The discussion presents an interpretation of this pattern of effects in terms of both the ongoing scientific and policy debates around violent video games and emerging standards for robust, evidence-based policy concerning young people's technology use. So yeah, pretty thorough right there. Next up, let's take a look at a policy statement from the American Psychological Association. Their excerpt on the matter reads as follows. This document, therefore, focuses upon the less publicized, more scientifically sound view that little evidence exists that playing violent video games produces violent criminal behavior. Scant evidence has emerged that makes any casual or correlational connection between playing violent video games and actually committing violent activities. By contrast, research evidence available to date indicates that violent video games have minimal impact on violent activity in society. Correlational and longitudinal studies of youth suggest that violent video game exposure does not meaningfully predict youth physical aggression or violent crime. Some research has suggested that youth with more aggressive personalities may seek out violent games. However, violent games do not increase assaultive behavior among such youth. Further, little clear evidence has emerged that youth identified as at risk due to elevated mental health symptoms are influenced to become more aggressive due to exposure to violent video games. Further, evidence from societal data examining video game violence use has yet to document that such use is predictive of violent crime. Similar absence of predictive relationships has been observed for violent movies. Analyses of mass homicide perpetrators themselves have not identified substantial links with violent video games. A 2002 analysis by the U.S. Secret Service suggested that school shooters tended to consume relatively low amounts of violent media compared to normative levels for same-age peers. This finding does not mean that if violence-prone youth watched more violent videos, they would be less likely to be violent. This finding simply means that no link has been found between school shooters and their video game habits. So, in other words, those with aggressive personalities might seek out more aggressive video games as an outlet, but it's not the video game itself directly causing that aggression. And when it comes to school shooters specifically, they actually tend to consume less violent media than normal. All of this, by the way, comes from research conducted from 2002 all the way to 2016. Now, you'll notice that among the researchers named in this report was Dr. Ferguson, a Stetson University professor who led the committee that developed this policy statement. When Dr. Ferguson was interviewed recently by the New York Times, he scoffed at the notion that video games cause real-world violence with the following statement: "The data on bananas causing suicide is about as conclusive. Literally, the numbers work out about the same." I really don't think this can be spelled out more clearly. Video games are not to blame for mass shootings. Anyone with common sense knows this, and anyone with moral and intellectual integrity is willing to acknowledge this. I mean, just look at Japan. 60% of the population there plays video games, but the country's annual gun deaths rarely go beyond the single digits, whereas the US in 2019 alone, and keep in mind that the year is still young, there have been 253 mass shootings and 8,896 casualties from gun violence as of the publishing of this video. One way Japan mitigates gun violence, they put a system in place that can weed out those who shouldn't be wielding lethal weapons. According to Business Insider, people can own certain guns in Japan, but they have to go through a series of physical and psychological tests to ensure that they're physically and psychologically fit to do so. People have to take an all-day class, pass some written test, achieve a 95% accuracy during shooting range test, and they have to pass a mental health evaluation that takes place in a hospital, as well as pass a background check, where the government looks into your criminal record, as well as interviews your family and friends to make sure everything's okay on that front. It's kind of like how there is a process behind getting a driver's license and being able to drive a car on your own. There's a system to educate people, to do background checks, to look at past history, and to make sure that they're fit to drive responsibly before they're allowed to own cars. Does that 100% guarantee that there won't be any incidents and accidents whatsoever? No, but things would certainly be much worse without such a system in place. So there are things America can do as a country to mitigate the ridiculous rate at which mass shootings and gun deaths are currently happening, because things can't stay the way they are, right? I mean, something has to change, but those kinds of steps in the right direction can't be taken if blame is just shifted to video games and other things that have absolutely no link to these kinds of acts of violence. And from the looks of it, the general public tends to agree with this stance, judging by the backlash that the blame on video games generated, and researchers also agree based on studies that have been conducted over the course of decades that disprove these politicians' propaganda. So, to make a long story short, to these sleazy politicians, I say nobody is buying your bullshit, so stop making asses of yourselves with laughable arguments that exploit a medium that's brought so much joy to so many people as propaganda to detract from core issues and your lack of integrity. If video games really trained and brainwashed people to become killing machines, then Mario players would have a graveyard full of crushed turtles in their backyards, Tekken players would become renowned martial artists, FIFA players would flood all the major soccer leagues, and God of War players would start calling children boy instead of their birth name. These are one man's take on the whole situation anyway. I'd love to hear what your thoughts and opinions are on what politicians had to say about video games recently in light of these mass shootings in the comments below. With that, I would like to end this news update and discussion video. Thank you for tuning in. To be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.